Thanks for coming, Tony.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here, Steve.
One of the reasons why we wanted to talk to you is, we're seeing already over $4 million spent on the state house races. That includes the governor's race, the legislative races, which is about $700,000 worth of that. And a lot of that money is being spent, or all that money is being spent independent of the campaigns themselves. Can you talk about why that is happening, and what does that tell us about what's going on with campaign finance?
Well, it tells us a number of things. First, let's begin with the fact, as you know, we're seeing record spending in the elections this year, and it's going to continue right through to Election Day. And much of the money that we're being spent are by independent groups or outside groups. In some cases, groups that are formed here in Maine, such as Maine Forward. In other cases, groups that are more national groups, such as the Governors Associations or the League of Conservation Voters. And what that shows is the changes that have taken place in our politics, both in terms of the politics and in terms of the laws regarding campaign finance. Let's begin with the politics first. Generally, it's the case that you're going to see high levels of spending whenever you have a competitive election. And it's the case this year, certainly in Maine, that we have a number of competitive elections, not just the governor's race, which is most important, but also in the 2nd District. We have an open seat, which has drawn a lot of national interest. We also, in the state legislature, have a number of very competitive races. So as a result, when you have more competition, you tend to have higher levels of spending, and you tend to have an incentive for groups that favor one candidate or another to want to become involved in the race because they see an opportunity for their side to win. And we also see this because of the general partisanship that we see in the country now. As the divide between Democrats and Republicans has intensified, the stakes on having a Democrat or a Republican, whether it be in the Congress, in the State House, or in a state legislature, have become higher. And the two national party organizations have taken a much greater interest in seeing their candidates get elected, which has given them a greater incentive to get involved at the state and local level. And the third reason why we see this change in our politics is that state legislatures and state houses have just become more important. One of the effects of the gridlock in Congress and the inability of Congress to pass even the most basic necessary laws is that organized groups and parties have started to focus more on the state level. States have really become more important in terms of policy making over the course of the last decade or so, whether it be tax law changes, subsidies for corporations to come and invest in the state, energy policy, whether it be anything from alternative energy like we see here in Maine with our attempts to develop some alternative energies, or whether you see some states where fracking and natural gas exploration has become more important, programs with respect to health care, assistance to those who are less well off, to marriage equality, or something like legalization of marijuana. All the major changes are largely taking place at the state level. Consequently, there's been a great incentive to focus on state legislatures now because they seem to be more important as policy-making bodies. Independent of the politics, of course, we've also had a lot of changes in the campaign finance laws. The courts have struck down a lot of the provisions in the law that used to prevent corporations or labor unions from spending money directly. They've struck down a lot of the provisions in the law that used to limit the contributions that groups could spend in elections, now essentially saying if you spend money independently, you can accept unlimited contributions to do that so long as you don't coordinate with the candidate. So that you've also had this freeing up of these groups to be able to spend money and get involved, often by relying on a handful of relatively large donors. And so that's really changed the balance of power, if you will. It's no longer the candidate alone or maybe the party that's spending money, but now there's a lot of competition from these outside groups.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because it's one of the interesting things that I've noticed has been that a lot of people talk about super PACs, but there's a distinction between super PACs and some of these other groups that are essentially groups that are affiliated with a nonprofit, which either tap their respective treasuries, but we don't know who are funding those nonprofits. Is that right?
That's right. In fact, we have two basic problems. In one way, the laws become simpler because a lot of the restrictions in the law have been struck down. But that's really complicated the financing of these campaigns because now you have a lot of different actors. Generally, the groups will take a form based on the strategy they want to pursue. So, for example, a super PAC is a political committee that can take unlimited contributions from any permissible source and spend that on ads advocating a candidate so long as they don't coordinate with the candidate. And they disclose all of their contributions and they report them to the Federal Election Commission or to the State Election Commission, depending on state law. And therefore you can see who's giving the money. Then there's a second form, which is known as a 527 group.
It's like the Republican Governors Association or the Democratic
Governors Association, the Democratic Governors Association are two perfect examples. These are groups that are formed for the purpose of influencing elections, so they're political groups. But because they are not necessarily limited to federal elections or to state elections, they don't necessarily report to the Federal Election Commission or to the State Election Commission in the given state. Rather, they're required to report their donations to the IRS.
Right.
And quarterly they file with the IRS and they list the donors to their organization. Then there is a third form, which is a nonprofit organization, the most common of which, the ones that we see here in Maine, are known as 501c4 organizations. They're social welfare policy advocacy groups. They're tax-exempt organizations because their principal purpose is not politics. Their principal purpose is to advocate social welfare policies, to engage in activities that promote social welfare. Many of them are policy advocacy groups. And because they're a nonprofit corporation, they are not allowed to spend the majority of their money on politics, but they're allowed to spend some money on politics. But it has to be a not substantial amount. And because of that, they don't report or disclose their donors. What they may do is disclose money that they spend on an ad, but they don't report where the money came from. And because of that, these have become much more prominent. They are now responsible for a larger and larger share of the advertising, because if you have individuals who want to support a candidate but they don't want to be disclosed, they don't want people to know that they're one of the major donors behind this, you can go ahead and use the C4, and then generally many of them adopt a very generic name, such as Citizens for a Strong Economy, Citizens for a Safer America. So it's very hard for voters to tell who's really behind the advertising.
I often wondered what the long-term consequences of this is. If you have these groups and they're spending a lot of money in state-level races, what message does that send to either political parties or state legislators, gubernatorial candidates? What happens? Do they begin to only pursue policies that are aligned with these particular interest groups, or is there some other outcome?
Well, the concern is the influence they might have in the end on legislative voting or on the actions that any given state takes. One of the concerns by particularly those who are increasingly alarmed by the growth of these groups is that this may end up influencing voting behavior. Or we're already seeing some of this on Capitol Hill in Washington, where legislators, in basically thinking about a vote, have to be concerned about, if I vote one way or the other, will this result in an independent group coming in and spending $100,000 or $200,000 against me in my next election campaign? So I like to compare it with kind of a shot across the bow, a kind of signal to legislators, this could happen to you.
Right.
And therefore, you have to be concerned about the influence they have. A second, more direct influence, of course, is that as some of these groups spend large amounts of money, legislators are going to be more responsive to their demands. I mean, this is one of the things, if you want to put it in a broader context, that people have always argued about the National Rifle Association, right? For a long time, The NRA was a group that was willing to spend money independently against candidates, and there's a lot of evidence that that's been one of the things that tends to both influence their voting and, conversely, has led to more legislators supported by the NRA eventually gaining office. So that there's a real concern about the policy consequences. A second concern is about just what it does to our politics. If you look at the advertising by these groups, it tends to be more negative than the types of ads you might see from a candidate or party. It makes it very difficult for voters to hold those advertising responsible and accountable for their advertising, because you don't vote for the group at the ballot box. So it's very different from an ad sponsored by a candidate. And generally, because these groups are independent, a candidate can say, well, my campaign has nothing to do with that ad. So what you're seeing now are campaigns that are more or less kind of two parts. The candidate will do positive ads about their campaign and ads about why they should be elected, and leave the negative ads or the contrast ads against the other candidate to the independent groups. And those groups are often much harsher in their attacks than you would see from a party committee or from a candidate. And that leads to the third concern people have. Those who are concerned with parties and their role in the political process and are concerned that parties help to bring disparate groups together. Parties have an incentive in trying to get a broad range of voters out. Parties have an incentive in some ways to work with legislators to try to come to some common policy approach. Are concerned that what you're now getting is much more division and fractionalization because of the role of these outside groups. In many races, you'll see now these outside groups outspend the party, and they've become the bigger voice in some of these elections. And so those who are now concerned about the role of parties, who are concerned about kind of the political fabric tearing apart, are wondering, how do you restore some kind of balance given the disparate rules and the way the system is developing? And that's why there's a lot of calls for more campaign reform, either on restricting these groups or on freeing up the parties to be able to take more money and spend more money to try to counterbalance the role of these groups.
Interesting.